Hello and welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world or in Britain, to Goldster Inside Story. I'm your host, Humphrey Hawksley, for the next hour, where we are going to be transported to the intrigue, the betrayals, the exotic settings, and the flamboyant characters of the late 1950s and 60s in one of the most gripping stories I have read of that time. The book's title is Love and Deception, Philby in Beirut. Kim Philby was the British spy who revealed critical secrets to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. My guest today is the author, and by God, can he tell a story. It made me think that maybe we should swap things around. John le Carré's fictional accounts somehow become more credible than the factual accounts of the incredible things people actually did. This is a love story. It's a political story, it's scheming, and it's full of passion. It has been praised by great literary figures such as William Boyd, Marina Hyde, Tom Bower, and Rachel Trethewey, who has been an Goldster Inside Story guest, which means that we're mixing in the right circles. And before I actually introduce our mild-mannered guest waiting patiently on the Wales-England border, I must add that he's an investigative journalist who knows how politicians think. He's done a book on David Cameron. Anyone remember him? And on phone hacking. Remember that scandal? And last week we heard Russian spies had hacked the phone of Liz Truss. Who's she? Anyone remember her? And before I vanish along too many tangents, welcome James Hanning to Goldster Inside Story.
Hello, Humphrey. Thank you. You're very kind. That's a very, very nice build-up. I hope I don't disappoint, but thank you.
You will not disappoint, James, because you've read the book and I've read the book, and you can't disappoint, even if we talk about something completely different, because it is a really, really good read. And I would like to ground myself, actually, and our audience and our conversation. So firstly, tell us, who was Kim Philby?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up hearing about this awful man, Kim Philby, and I thought, this man, he can't be as awful as my parents, for example, make him out to be. And I've always been curious to know a bit more about him. What is fairly well known is that he was born in at the beginning of the 20th century. He went in India. He went to Westminster and then Cambridge, and he was at Cambridge at a time of great political turmoil, when a lot of idealistic young men were getting very fired up about the world's injustices, and there were a lot of injustices. Hitler was on the rise in Germany. Fascism was also on the rise in Spain. Mussolini was in charge in Italy. There was a lot of economic strife in Britain. The Labour Party didn't seem to be doing much good in remedying that, and in fact went into what we now call a grand coalition. And in the eyes of a lot of people on the left, sort of sold out to the average worker. And Philby was very radicalized by all this, and went to Vienna, where again fascism was on the rise. There was a lot of anti-Semitism around, and he fell under the spell of a man called Arnold Deutsch, who was evidently a very sympathetic, kind of smiling, agreeable, very intelligent, a lot of emotional intelligence, who was a Russian recruiter. This was through various friends of his, and
Philby was a student then, or he was a
no, he was. This was just after his time, but he was. He and a group of friends who became known as many of us will know as the Cambridge Five. There was a real what Andrew Boyle called a climate of treason, and a lot of angry young men would go off to fight in Spain, for example, and they would kind of show their radicalism or belief in democracy or whatever you want to call it in different ways. And Philby was persuaded that the way he might achieve most was to burrow into the bowels of the British establishment and help Moscow in that way. The reason he wanted to help Moscow was that he became convinced that the only way of standing up to fascism was through communism. You will remember that there was a big debate about appeasement in Britain, and Philby believed that the British were simply not prepared to go to war and not prepared to stand up to fascism. And he thought this was a great outrage, which is why he and, well, at least 4 of his chums signed up with Moscow. Now, when... sorry.
That's I mean, just as you're going through that timeline there, what did he think then when Moscow, communist Soviet Union and fascist Germany signed the pact that allowed the invasion of Poland? Exactly.
There was the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that was a huge shock to all of them. Goronmy Rees, who was thought to have been one of them, he just said, "I'm out of here. I'm having nothing to do with this. This is a complete betrayal." And I think Philby was very thrown by it. But ultimately, he said, "Well, I know which side I'm on. I'm on Moscow's side." And they persuaded themselves that this was something they had to put up with as a way of buying time before they could fight fascism. And that's I mean, that was the reason given by Anthony Blunt when he was exposed, years and years later. He said, "Well, we had, the time had to be bought before anybody was ready to fight Hitler, and that was just it was a kind of kicking for touch move."
And just describe for us Kim Philby's sort of character. He had a certain flamboyance, charisma about him, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if I had £1 for everybody who said he was the most charming person imaginable, he was slightly diffident, seemingly a little shy, but with a real conceit, as we perhaps will see in the course of our conversation. He had an extraordinary commitment to what he believed in. But everybody loved him. He was very, very, women found him very attractive. He had a sort of glint in his eye. I think one of them talked about an animal magnetism. And he was, I mean, he took advantage of the opportunities that presented themselves with women. And he was a real charmer. But the word charming is sometimes misleading, I think. I mean, it wasn't just, oh yes, he had a gift, he had the gift of the gab. People really, they loved him. He was just extraordinarily popular. And the number of people who said when they heard what he'd been up to, they just said, "We just couldn't believe it. Good old Kim." It was an extraordinary thing. And that to me is part of the fascination.
And then, so after the war was over and he was still passionate about fighting fascism or adhered to communism, he became a diplomat. Then what happened?
Well, he joined MI6 in 1941, and he had quite a distinguished war. And he was, I mean, some say he was destined for the top. He was going to be the head of MI6. But at the end of the war, and I think that may well be right. I don't think anybody can say for certain. But at the end of the war, he was put in charge of the section of MI6 which was in charge of catching moles. In other words, he was the boss of the outfit that was supposed to be catching him, right. Which was the most extraordinary, coup for the Russians. Now, of course, nobody had any idea of this at the time. And he was sent to Turkey. He was sent to the States on a very sort of top-level job. He made lots of useful contacts in the States. He was in charge of liaising between MI6 and the CIA, and was very successful in that. Everybody loved him. He had lots of boozy lunches with a guy called James Angleton, who was a very senior figure in the CIA. He was completely, like everyone else, completely charmed by him. And then in 1951, things started getting sticky. Two British diplomats called Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean disappeared. And it was a complete mystery, and nobody knew where they'd gone. And to cut a long story short, they'd gone to Moscow, and it turned out that they were two of the famous Cambridge Five. They'd been spying for the Russians as Philby had. And the question then arose, well, how did they get away? And it was the timing was very significant because Maclean was under suspicion for being a Russian spy. And he disappeared a couple of days before he was going to be questioned. Now, the timing of this was too good to be true. And people started saying, well, hang on, somebody must have tipped him off. So then the search for the third man came up. Who was the third man who tipped off Burgess and Maclean? Yeah. And the Americans started saying, well, it's that guy Philby. And the British, of course, having known Philby a long time and knowing that he went to the right school and the right university, of course, would have none of it. Said, no, he's a good egg. He's one of us. The Americans, they were insistent, and they made the British sack Philby from MI6. That was in 1951. They said, we don't trust that guy. He's a wrong 'un. So for the next 4 or 5 years, he was at times literally hanging around on street corners. He couldn't get work. He had this big shadow hanging over him, and he was in a bit of a mess. His home life. He had 5 children by that time. His home life was pretty unhappy, and he was kind of in the wilderness.
What was he? So he was semi-exposed, as it were. What had he given the Russians that was critical in the Cold War fight?
Well, this is one of the extraordinary things. People don't really know exactly what Philby gave the Russians. There was a lot of interest in the building of the atom bomb and so on, and Philby had a good deal to do with that, as did Donald Maclean. In the kind of drawing up of the east-west border of Europe, there were a lot of Philby tipped off the Russians about a lot of what the Russians would have called dissidents, people who wouldn't accept the division of certain parts of Eastern Europe and the sort of apportioning of that to Russian, effectively to Russian rule. So that there were a lot of, particularly, I mean, Albania is the example that people are often cite, that Philby tipped off the Russians about attempts by the West to take back Albania, so that a lot of people were, who, for example, were parachuted into Albania to try and seize control of that country. They were just shot as they came out of the sky because Philby and others, it has to be said, had tipped the Russians off. And may I just quote a line? I mean, I'm very interested in the human side of Philby, but one mustn't forget. And so at an event I was speaking to recently, somebody said, "You haven't used the word traitor about him." And I said, "Well, I don't mean to minimize what he did. I mean, he was absolutely a traitor, and nobody puts this better than the late David Cornwell, the spy writer John le Carre. I've just got a brief couple of sentences. He said, David Cornwell said Philby's influence was ubiquitous and had haunted his entire career as an MI6 officer. That's Cornwell, who was in MI6. Quotes, "The more one discovered about him, the more evident it was that whatever one was doing in the past could have been compromised by Philby. The Russians knew so much about Western security that if some disaster had not taken place, it must not have happened by kind permission of the KGB. The scale of Philby's betrayal is barely imaginable to anyone who has not been in the business. In Eastern Europe alone, dozens and perhaps hundreds of British agents were imprisoned, tortured, and shot." So, lest we forget, it's a pretty serious charge sheet.
There's blood on their hands. Just a couple of points I want to pick up. Burgess and Maclean, what were they doing, and did Philby know about them, or were they all in separate cells, as it were?
Well, this is one of the interesting things about the Cambridge Five. They did all know about one another, which is quite unusual, as I'm sure you know. Spies are generally kept in their silos, and they're not allowed to know too much about what their colleagues sort of next door, as it were, are doing. Burgess Maclean had joined the Foreign Office in 1936 and was sending lots of really potent documents to Moscow. I mean, an enormous quantity of documents to Moscow from as early as 1936. Burgess worked for again, they'd both been at Cambridge with Philby. Burgess worked at the BBC, was considered absolutely brilliant, actually became quite friendly with Winston Churchill. And then after he worked for the BBC, he joined the Foreign Office as well. And they were sort of burrowing deep into the establishment, as it were, for 10 or so years until 1951, when they just vanished overnight.
Yes, and another point, which is a wider point that I wanted to bring up, was when you were introducing the sort of political scenario in the 1930s. There, you talked about the ideological dissident struggle in the universities, Labour not doing much, nobody quite knowing whose side they should be on, because it sort of gelled with what is going on at the moment, particularly with a resurgent Russia. And the question about, is democracy liberal in illiberal democracy and that sort of thing. Do you detect a sort of cycle happening here, or am I plucking at fruit that doesn't exist?
I don't know. I mean, I do. I mean, I don't have the sense there's a lot of idealism about at the moment. I mean, it's all pretty mean-spirited and cynical, it seems to me. There's not, and you know, what Putin's doing is essentially all about power, whereas these guys in the 30s, they were zealots, but they were idealists. They did believe, and I don't think one can underestimate that. Sorry, I don't think one can exaggerate that. I think there was a genuine commitment to this new society that the Russians were trying to build. And it's important to remember that communism had not been tried then. Well, it had been, well, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, it was being tried, but they were trying to reverse an enormous number of things that had gone on in Tsarist Russia and previously. But there was this belief that actually we can build a new society, a kinder, nicer society. Now, this may sound absurdly naive to modern ears, but they were real believers, and
it captured it captured a global imagination. Yeah, sorry, I said it captured a global imagination, whereas now there is nothing that captures a global imagination to compete with the free market democratic capitalism, or whatever you call it, that we've got now.
Indeed.
To our audience, any questions you want to ask James about the Cold War, Kim Philby, anything at all, just put it into the chat and we will feed it into our conversation. And I want to go, now that you've set it up so brilliantly, actually, you've got an idea. The other word in your book is Beirut. Before we talk about Philby there, you call it the city of spies. What is Beirut? Where is it, and why was it such a crossroads, or why is it still such a crossroads?
Well, in the early 50s, the place to be in the Middle East was Cairo. There were great colonial connections with Cairo. A lot of diplomats wanted to be in Cairo. The whole oil boom was accessible from Cairo. And for all sorts of historical reasons, Cairo was the place to be. And then along came Nasser, Colonel Nasser, and he was proselytizing about a new breed of what was regarded in the West as very aggressive Arab nationalism. And whatever one thinks of Nasser, a lot of people in the West said, well, actually, this is getting uncomfortable. I mean, I won't bore your listeners with all that. But a lot of people felt, actually, there is a place, as it were, up the road, which was Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon, which was on the Mediterranean. It was just sort of round the corner, as it were. On the Mediterranean, was a bit of a sort of international melting pot. It was accessible to the West, accessible to Arab money and so on. strategically quite interesting. Connections were very good, very peaceful. It was a nice place for diplomats and journalists and so on, and anybody who wanted to keep their finger on the pulse of the Middle East. It was a very agreeable place to be. And so a lot of companies found themselves and companies, diplomats, journalists, and so on, found themselves moving from Cairo to Beirut. And it was indeed it was a very agreeable place. The climate was nice, a lot of agreeable French restaurants and so on, and a good place to bring up families. I spoke to a guy many of your listeners will know, Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer of the band The Police.
Yes.
And he was growing up there. His father was in the CIA. He grew up in Beirut, and he just says it was an absolutely idyllic time. He was sort of 10 or 11 at the time, and he used to jump on a kind of local bus, and his parents had no concerns about their children's safety or anything. The sun was always shining, it seems, and it was a great place to be. So that's why a lot of people found it an attractive place.
So that is, and before we take Kim Philby there, we have a question which is an interesting one. Jean Joyce has asked her, I've always wondered why no one was aware of Philby's communist sympathies, and if they were, why were they ignored?
Well, exactly, yes. It is extraordinary now. With hindsight, one thinks, well, why did nobody stop him? A lot of reasons. Class. He went to the right schools and universities and so on. He was very charming. The British were very naive. They didn't believe really that anybody could sign up to such a sort of, there's something quite culturally sort of foreign about signing up to Marxism. The British belief in implicit belief in liberalism is a very, very strong thing, and it was just a bit odd to sign up to this dogma. So I think people didn't really want to believe that, and also, there was a key moment when he went for a sort of interview over lunch, which it was attended by his father, and Philby at a certain point got up to go to the loo, and the interviewer said to Philby's father, wasn't he a communist at university? And he said, oh, well, yeah, but he's over all that. No, he's grown out of that, don't worry. And they went, oh, righto, there we are. That's good enough for us. So he went. It is bizarre. It's comical, but it's obviously, not funny at all.
Yes, that's, and of course, today, in fact, we have a question coming in to take my question. So I'll read Patrick's question. What's MI6's current recruitment policy influenced by the Cambridge 5 ? China seems to recruit some university students for its industrial espionage. Could you give us a comparison there?
Gosh, I don't know. I just don't know. I did get very interested in that a few years ago, but I'm not up to speed on that, I'm afraid. Yes, I know they try and the assumption that if you went to the right school and so on, which seems to have been implicit in the 30s and 40s, I'm pretty sure that's all gone. Although it must help if so and so had a father or whatever in the service, but. No, I think they try and spread their net a bit more widely, but I'm afraid I wouldn't like to stick my neck out on that.
There is now this sort of swing with China, and of course, if going to the right school's got anything to do with the prime ministers it produces, we have to be a little question mark about that. But let us go back to Philby in Beirut. He went there as a correspondent, as a journalist, didn't he? Take us through that.
Yes. Well, just to wind back a year or so from the time he turned up in Beirut in 56, but what had happened in 55 was that the Americans, I say, who were desperate to prove that Philby was a Russian spy, the Americans arranged for him to be named in the House of Commons. Because they thought this was the way of flushing him out, as it were. And what happened was that the Foreign Secretary, Harold Macmillan at the time, was then forced to make a statement in response to this. So they kind of emptied out the drawers and looked down the back of the sofa and so on, and couldn't come up with any evidence that he definitely was a Russian spy. So they had to, innocent until proven guilty and all that, they had to conclude that he wasn't. So Macmillan got up in the House of Commons and said, we have no reason to believe Philby is the third man, if indeed there was one. Whereupon Philby's friends in MI6 said, well, we told you so. We told you he was a good guy. We've got to find this guy a job. He's been horribly traduced.
Oh my God.
He's been kicked out of the MI6. He had a great glittering future ahead of him and knighthoods and all that. And instead, he's sort of out on the streets. So they teamed up and rang out their chums and arranged for him to return to his original trade. He'd worked for the Times in the 1930s. I didn't mention, sorry. He returned to his original trade, which was journalism. And the Observer and the Economist employed him to be their correspondent in Beirut. And he arrived just after the invasion of the Suez Canal in the summer of 1956, which was a heck of a time to get there, actually. And of course, he arrived and knew very few people. He was helped, though, by his father, who was rather a distinguished, if very eccentric, Arabist, who knew loads of people in the Middle East, and he introduced Kim to his illustrious chums in the Middle East. And he kind of took to it like a duck to water, rather to people's surprise, because he actually had no great interest in the Middle East previously.
And did he, was he still, we don't know, you just said, but was he still working for the Soviets then? I mean, what were his connections?
Well, yes, this was part of the arrangement. He would go there. I mean, to say that his cover job was as a journalist wouldn't be right. I mean, he did go as a journalist, but at the same time, MI6, as I say, having believed his name had been cleared, MI6 asked him to do a few jobs for them while he was there, which, from what I can gather, meant passing information back, a bit of recruiting. He just made himself useful to MI6 by keeping his ear to the ground, keeping in touch with people, and so on. So he was useful to MI6. He was paid by them in cash. It was sort of off the books. The Americans would have been furious had they known. And then within 2 or 3 years, the Russians left him alone because they thought, well, if we go near him and MI6 get wind of it, he'll be sunk. So they felt they had to leave him. But they did. So they did leave him for 2 or 3 years, and then they got back in touch. And then he started doing stuff for the Russians as well.
So what year are we now? Sort of these 1960-ish?
By 60, he had 4 bosses. Yes, the Observer, the Economist, MI6, and the Russians. It was, I think, late 58. The Russians got, or maybe 59. The Russians got in touch again. I mean, he wasn't. There's no point in pretending he was giving them sort of nuclear secrets at that point, because the British were. There were British people in the intelligence community who were very skeptical of him, actually. His old chums in MI6 generally were supportive of him, but there were others who were much more skeptical. So he wasn't privy to a lot of very high grade stuff from MI6, but he was just useful to them, and he tried to make himself as useful as he could to the Russians as well.
And in the subtitle of the book, I've got 2 things: deception, I think we've covered, but love. Who was Eleanor?
Yeah, well, as I say, he took to Beirut like a duck to water. One of his first sort of social encounters in Beirut was arranged by an old friend of his called Sam Pope Brewer. Sam Pope Brewer he had known in Spain in the 30s, when Philby went to Spain a bit for the Times. And they were old chums, and they'd kept up the friendship when Kim was in Washington in the 1949 to 51. And Sam's old chum Kim arriving in Beirut was going to be a lot of fun as far as Sam was concerned. They drank a lot of whiskey together and so on. And anyway, Sam arranged to meet Kim for a drink. And as it turned out, there was a lot going on with Suez and so on, as I say. And Sam had to be away on the day they'd arranged. So he asked his wife to go instead. And his wife, yes, was Eleanor. Now, Philby being Philby, of course, charmed her enormously. Actually, Brewer's marriage to Eleanor was not happy. Eleanor was bored, had a very distinguished time. She'd had an impressive career before the war. She'd worked well in a kind of public service role, doing cultural and communication stuff during the war, and had had an impressive time and stayed in Europe, and then married Brewer in 47. Anyway, by 56, she and Brewer were getting pretty tetchy with one another. They had a daughter who was effectively the one keeping the marriage together. But anyway, so when Philby arrived with his oodles of British charm,
swept her off her feet.
And the relationship was a big secret for a couple of years. They fell madly in love with each other. Now, I should caveat this by saying it's very difficult to know what goes on in Kim Philby's head through a lot of this. But I mean, I did a lot of digging as far as I could. And if you look at Philby's love letters to her and so on, he is besotted with her, and vice versa. And people used to
they had a secretive, they had a sort of a secretive affair in Beirut, which would be quite a small sort of circle, wouldn't it, of the cocktail parties, receptions, and all that sort of thing. And they so they would be at a sort of party, drinking champagne and dancing to the jazz music, and then go off and have their affair, and nobody would know about it.
Yes, well, I mean, it is extraordinary. They used to go off for kind of days in the country. Beirut, I don't know if you know Lebanon, but outside Beirut, there's some very attractive sort of hills and so on. Mm-hmm. And Sam had a chauffeur, and Eleanor and Kim used to go off with the chauffeur to the country and have their sessions together. And I mean, it was secret. It was secret for a while, and then I mean, as far as I can make out, I'm pretty sure it was the chauffeur who told Sam that.
I was going to say, did the chauffeur's lips were sealed or not? But
anyway, and eventually,
happened, James?
I'm sorry.
So, and then what happened? They married eventually, and
they married, and they had the most blissfully happy time. I mean, they were, as I say, they were regarded as the happiest couple in Beirut. They went to a lot of parties. They both drank an enormous amount. I mean, there's no getting away from that. But they were a sort of must at every diplomatic party. Everybody loved good old Kim. He was filing his copy for the Observer and the Economist, and doing it sort of standing on his head, really. I mean, he wasn't a particularly stylish writer, but he was a very competent performer, particularly for a Sunday market. His copy was very analytical and sort of serious and reliable. And Eleanor would paint watercolors. She was very interested in the arts, would go off into the countryside to look at archaeological sites and so on. And they had a on the surface, anyway, an absolutely blissful time.
And then what happened?
Well, the Americans, who are kind of still slogging away, trying to prove that Philby was guilty, put various people on his tail, and including this man, Miles Copeland, who's the father of Stuart Copeland, who was tasked with arranging as many parties and social events as he could with involving Philby, so they could sort of keep an eye on him and watch what he was up to and who he was talking to and so on. And Copeland and Philby became great friends, and the four of them, Copeland and his wife, and Eleanor and Kim, used to go off on sort of boating weekends up the coast and sort of carefully spying on one another, but also seemingly being very fond of one another. And it's an extraordinary thing. And there were other people, other Americans, who would be sort of standing on street corners, keeping an eye on Kim. But they never got the evidence. That said, Kim knew all along, and this was a sense that was mounting in his mind, that there were more and more dissidents and defectors, I should say, rather, coming over from Moscow to Britain and to the States. And one of them, he knew, might be in a position to identify him as having worked for the Russians.
Right.
And there was a lot of but of course he didn't know if this was a real threat, and he couldn't know what was going on in London and Washington, because of course nobody there was going to tell him. So it was this constant threat, and all the time the water was rising around him, as it were, and he was thinking, well, am I going to get found out? Am I going to get found out, or will he get away with it? Anyway, so to the outside world, he seemed insouciant, charming, lovely, with this lovely relationship with Eleanor. But under the surface, he was terrified, and that took its toll, with the drinking, which got worse and worse.
And eventually, how did he get to Moscow in the end?
Well, there is an extraordinary story of a typical evening in Beirut when Kim and Eleanor were invited to a dinner party, and Kim rang up from his office to Eleanor and said, "I'm sorry, darling, I'm going to be a bit late. Will you tell they were called the Balfour Pauls. Will you tell the Balfour Pauls that I'll be a little late, but I'll see you later?" And Eleanor duly went, "Yes, fine, okay." She duly went along to the dinner party, and 8 o'clock came, 9 o'clock came, 10 o'clock came, and no Kim. And there was this, I think there were 10 or 12 or so people at the dinner party. They all said, "Oh, well, Kim, he's probably, what journalism's like. He's probably got called away on a story, or he's probably fallen out, had too much to drink and fallen into bad company or something." And she said, no, he's never done this before. This is extraordinary. Anyway, midnight, she went home, no sign of him. And the head of MI6, the station chief at MI6 came round, and people, various officials from the embassy came round, and they said things like, "You realize your husband was no ordinary man," which is, if you think of the phrase "was no ordinary man," I mean, that's a pretty chilling. Yeah. And she had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. And the fact that they were talking in the past tense, and they were pretty confident, and they were right, that he'd gone to Moscow. He'd got on a boat in the port of Beirut at about 6 p.m. That Wednesday night, and he turned up in Moscow 6 months later, and she was absolutely shattered, as you can understand, and had no sense of, she would say, "Well, why would he go to Moscow? What happens in Moscow?"
So she had no idea about.
Sorry.
She had no idea about all the suspicion, the rising waters, as you say. She had no idea about any of that.
Well, she had absolutely no interest in politics, and almost prided herself on that, and just said, "Oh, that's Kim's stuff." and he would say occasionally, "Well, I'm doing stuff for MI6, so I can't say any more than that, darling." And she would
Shrug it off.
she would accept it. And she must have. I'm not going to say she must have had suspicions. She would have known that he had been accused of being the third man and so on. And actually, there is possibly a whole other strand of the story, which is, it's my belief actually that Sam Brewer, who had done a lot of work for the predecessor to the CIA during the war and was very close to the American intelligence services, I think Sam Brewer was one of those who was tasked, that's Eleanor's first husband, was one of those who was tasked with keeping an eye on him. Now, whether Eleanor knew this and fell in love with him despite that or what, I don't know. But there's a lot more, and I've applied to the CIA for the papers on Sam Brewer, and as you know, the CIA is freer with its documentation than MI6, much freer. But they've given me absolutely nothing, and I'm afraid I don't believe there's nothing there.
You just wrapped up the deception word there completely, because those husbands and wives don't know what is going on. I want to move on to other elements of your career in a moment, but just a couple of things in short. He arrives in Moscow. Does he get a hero's welcome?
Well, this is the great irony. If irony isn't too weak a word. Yeah, he turned up in Moscow. He was given a nice flat. He was given a nice washing machine, a nice vacuum cleaner, and so on. And given, they tried to make him feel privileged, which indeed he was by Russian standards. But no, he was not given a hero's welcome. They were very as nice to them as they could be, with one caveat: they didn't trust him. They thought he could well have been planted by MI6. So where he arrived, having in his mind dedicated most of his life to the service of the Soviet Union, and he arrived expecting to be put in charge of the KGB's operations in Western Europe or whatever. Not a bit of it. He never once went to the KGB's headquarters, other than for some he went once, I think, for a very minor reason. But he was a sort of prisoner in his flat. They gave him odd bits of work to do, and he helped. He wrote a book with somebody called Gordon Lonsdale, another British spy. But it was a fairly ghastly come down for him when he arrived.
And Eleanor, what happened there?
Well, I'd love to tell you what happened to Eleanor. I try not to give entirely give the game away. Eleanor, as you can imagine, was absolutely traumatized in the early months of 1963 after the great love of her life, and that's, I think, what he was, had just vanished like that. She was horrified. She, terrified. She didn't know if he was alive or dead. She didn't know if he'd been kidnapped. She had no idea for a long time. And it then slowly it emerged that yes, he had gone to Moscow, and she started receiving letters from him saying, "I can explain everything. Please, we must be reunited. Please, will you come to Moscow? I can explain everything and we can resume our wonderful life together." Now, as I mentioned, she had a daughter with Sam Brewer. The daughter had gone to live in the States. The daughter was born in 1948. So she was 15 or so. And the British were saying, well, you can't go to Moscow. You know what happens if you go to Moscow. You will never be allowed out again. You will never see your daughter again. So she was appallingly torn between going to meet up with Philby again and getting an explanation from him, for heaven's sake. I mean, she was, you'd be pretty angry if that had happened to you. But equally, he was this great love, and he wanted her. He was desperate for her to go to Moscow, and the prospect of possibly never seeing her daughter again. So that, in a rather horrible way, is where I generally leave the story.
With her dilemma.
With her dilemma, and the answer's in the book.
And we were going to move on to David Cameron phone hacking in the few minutes we've got left, but Jean Joyce asks another question that's on my mind. Do we know if Philby changed his mind about communism once he lived in Russia?
We do, and he didn't. He was. This is one of those things I would say. Everybody underestimated the strength of his commitment. A lot of people who'd signed up to communism in the 30s, by 1948-49, there was a famous book called The God That Failed, and it was by a lot of people who had thrown in their, or had expressed support for communism. And they changed their minds because they knew about the show trials, about what had happened in Eastern Europe and so on. But Philby never lost that faith, the faith that he adopted in his early 20s. And he didn't change after the Ribbentrop-Molotov deal. He didn't change after the war. And he went on and he stayed loyal to it until he died in 1988. Now, he was quite disaffected, I think, and he said, why can't there be more freedom in Russia? And the great dream that he had idealistically hoped might manifest itself, was not coming true. But he just said, well, this is a matter of time. This is, I am on the right side of history. You cannot. There's a very interesting quote he gave about Russian history, and say, well, you can't expect hundreds of years of despotism and autocracy just to be forgotten overnight. Of course, there are going to be bumps in the road, but no, he absolutely believed all his life.
And that is a thought. A lot of people that I talk to now are saying, it's now coming around again, that issue about the cycles that I mentioned in the universities and that. But what I'd like to press you on a couple of other books you've written. One of them is sort of like this because it's about hacking phones. You did the phone hacking scandal that embraced the press and the news of the world and everything like that. But without going into that, and without telling me exactly how do you hack a phone? Is it easy?
Well, it's not easy. It's not as easy as it was. It used to be extremely easy. And in the early days of voicemails, it was a very easy thing to do. What happens is that, what used to happen, certainly, is that it very often took, I think one person could do it on their own, but it's easiest to do it with two. One person would ring the phone of a celebrity and get them chatting so that the line would then be occupied. And then a second person would ring up the same number, which would be engaged and would be put through to voicemail. And then you would key in the code for that person's voicemail, and you would then pick up the messages. Now, if you say, well, how did you know what the code was? The answer is that most people just use the default code, the factory code, the code that is on the phone when you first buy it, which was I think 1, 2, 3, 4 or something. Yeah. So, and most people didn't realize there was a code. So most people were sitting ducks, and it was an absolute golden age for this sort of intrusion, and everybody was, well, everybody, a lot of red top newspapers were doing it.
Yes, the tunnel. But then there was a story last week, I think, that Liz Truss's phone might have been hacked by Russian spies. That would be a whole different method, isn't it? Because presumably that is secure and encrypted.
Well, again, I don't that story, which I confess I haven't tried to write anything or look into in enormous detail, but I would like to know more about that. I don't quite know how anybody knows that it was Russian spies who did it, or anybody's spies, or indeed, could it not have been a newspaper? I mean, the climate among newspapers is is a good deal better than it was then. I mean, it was like the Wild West in the early 2000s, but yeah.
So it could have been a newspaper, and then they leak that it's Russian spies, and the newspaper gets away with it.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the original story suggested that they got it from intelligence sources. Now, it's all quite murky. I'm not saying that's not what happened, but equally, needs to be very skeptical.
And talking about the unknown and murkiness, you wrote some years back now a biography or a book on David Cameron. I think that came out in 2009, just before he became Prime Minister. I was just wondering, so, you looked into this young up-and-coming politician and saw the trajectory that he went on. And, we all know the political shenanigans that we've had over the past few years. Do politicians, are they different people to the rest of us? Do they think differently?
Yes. I mean, there are people who say anybody who wants to be a politician should automatically be disqualified because it just feeds their sort of ego and vanity and so on. I don't know. I mean, Cameron himself was always quite interesting about this. And there is something... I mean, I'm not particularly an apologist for Cameron, I mean, we tried to write a kind of dispassionate book, and I think actually he thinks our book was pretty fair, certainly compared to one or two that followed ours. But he said, well, yes, politicians. Cameron himself said, well, politicians are a mixture of sort of vanity and public service, and I hope the balance with me is about right. And I think that's fair enough. I think he certainly he and his family have a strong sense of public duty and so on. Now, you might want to say that's just vanity in a different guise, but I think he does feel that. And I think generally, I'm going to say something slightly rather slanderous here, but I think most politicians do have a wish to make the world a better place. Of course, they're vain and they're conceited and so on, like the rest of us. But most of them have a sense of making the world a bit better, but by whatever standards they think, that should be judged. The person actually who I think one doesn't get that sense of is Boris Johnson. I think I just have no sense that he's serving. He feels that public service push. I'm afraid I think he was almost entirely out for himself, but maybe
yes,
that's
I mean, that is, and actually when you were describing Kim Philby to me, the charmer, that sort of presence that he had, I was thinking of Boris Johnson. Actually, he does have that sort of ability to charm people and bring them in, but with Philby there was this ideological passion of a cause, and with Johnson you think not.
Well, I don't see it, I must say. I mean, I think Philby was extraordinarily cold-blooded, and I mean, some people view him as a sociopath. I do think, whatever else he was, I do think you have to acknowledge that degree of. I mean, it's a bit grandiose to call it public service, but I think he did believe. He really did believe. Johnson, I'm afraid I regard as a careerist first and foremost. Very charming and entertaining one, but maybe he should have stayed in journalism.
should have stayed in journalism and after dinner speaking. James, stick with us for a second. I've got to tell our wonderful audience what's coming up. And if you've got any last minute questions for James, put them in the chat whilst I am speaking. First up, oh yeah, 1:30 today. That's in just over half an hour. That's nowish. I'm talking to the Goldster Chief Executive Officer and Founder about puzzles and a healthy mind. Writing books, as James knows, is figuring things out, the mystery, the action, the characters, and that's what we're going to be talking about, although beyond books, with Mark Carter in just over half an hour. And then tomorrow we're going to stay with how our brains work. And I'm going to be talking to Dr. Linda Shaw, neuroscientist, and her book is Your Brain is the Boss. And I'm also going to be asking Linda about whereabouts in our brain is something called the pleasure dome. Don't miss that one. And on Thursday, November the 10th, Lucinda is with Stephen Barker, author of The Flying Sikh. That is a story and a half, how Flying Officer Hardeep Singh Malit fought British bureaucracy and discrimination to become a First World War pilot. I bet he didn't go to the right schools. And November the 11th, that is Remembrance Day, Lucinda is with Tessa Dunlop, author of Elizabeth and Philip, A Story of Young Love, Marriage and Monarchy. That is Remembrance Day, and Tessa will be talking about her war history books as well. The Sentry Girls, the Bletchley Girls, and the Army Girls. That's it. James, we are out of time. So just before you go, Jean Joyce says, thanks, very interesting chat. Looking forward to reading the book. Already bought it. There we are. That was our buy link is working. Thank you for that, Jean. We got 2 minutes left. Name for me the Cambridge Five and encapsulate the impact that they had.
Well, the Cambridge Five were John Cairncross, Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, and Kim Philby. It's very difficult still to evaluate their effect. I suspect they had a big effect on Russian thinking before the war, for example, and indeed they may have contributed to the Russians getting into bed with Hitler before the war. That's very hard to prove. There are still loads of documents which haven't seen the light of day. But the effect it had on recruitment and nervousness in MI6 in the 50s and 60s was enormous, and I think there was a real fear all the time. I mean, they were absolutely traumatized by that.
And Anthony Blunt, of course, stayed secret for a long time, and he was the evaluator of the Queen's art collection, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. No, he was pardoned in 64 after Philby disappeared. Anthony Blunt was given immunity from, not pardoned, but he was given immunity from prosecution. And the agreement was that it would be kept under wraps as long as he revealed who his co-conspirators were. And the government honoured that until 1979.
And then across the pond in America, because you talked a lot about the Americans being on Philby's back all the time. They had their spy scandals, didn't they? That were actually, or do we know had much more impact than ours?
They did, yes, they did. I mean, I don't have the sense that they were quite as traumatized as the British establishment was, but no, they did, and indeed details of that are still coming out. And there's a very lively debate in the States about those spies, and indeed about some of the defectors who went to the States and so on. Were they genuine, and so on and so on. There's a vigorous debate, which keeps some of us busy for a long time, I think.
Yes, it's that sort of what we see in the James Bond movies. The CIA agent comes in and there's James Bond, and you see immediately the cultural difference that you have there, isn't it? That's it. Time's winged chariot is upon us. James, thank you for talking so vividly about the world of spies and the city of spies, Kim Philby and Beirut. You are a Goldster star. We can make you an honorary Goldster star. Thank you, our Goldster audience, for keeping us on our toes. What a great show we have had. Very informative, really insightful. Until tomorrow with neuroscientist Linda Shaw and her Pleasure Dome, among other things, and with me, Mark Carter, in half an hour. Stay curious, stay active, stay safe, and of course, stay Goldster. Thank you, James Hanning. Totally brilliant. Bye. Thank you.